The other aspect of this, of course, is about war. Just as I said we need a red armband view of Australian history, we certainly need a charge of the left brigade on the questions of war and peace, of Anzac and Gallipoli. You probably know that the Australian government has promised some extra $15 million towards the centenary of Anzac in 4 years' time. Now, I know people around the left whose response to this is to say either, I want nothing to do with it, turn their back on it. Others say, I'll stand on the outside and throw stones. I don't think either of those things are going to be very effective for what we need to do. What we need to do is to get in there and say, we have a story about Anzac and Gallipoli too. It's a story you don't want to hear. It's a story which we can focus around, for example, Simpson and his donkey. The image they love to promote all the time. Indeed, Howard put out a poster. Some of you may have seen it. They were sent around to the schools. It's the statue of Simpson and the donkey and the wounded soldier being brought down. And underneath it, it says, character is destiny. George Eliot. Now, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool sceptic. Whenever I see a quotation, I think, what was the context? So I traced it back. I suspect they took it off the bottom of a calendar. I suspect also if they knew that George Eliot was a woman, they may not have used it. But when you go to the novel and read what she says, it's a quotation from a German novelist called Jean-Paul. And she says, of all the stupid things Jean-Paul ever said, this was the stupidest. So here we've got Simpson. Now, they don't want to be reminded of that, but what they don't want to know about Simpson is that Simpson was a red-hot trade unionist. He was an Englishman. He came here. He wrote to his mum and said, when are you going to have a revolution and get rid of all those millionaires and dukes? The reason he was in the AIF was he was unemployed in Australia and he thought he could get a free lift back to England. Peter Cochrane's written a wonderful book that deals with all of this and the way in which the real story's been concealed. There are the left-wing VC winners. Hugo Throssell in Western Australia. The working class VC winners, like Jacker, who had to sell his medals during the Depression in order to live. Bert Facey, who came back from the war, from that fortunate life as a pacifist. Many, many of the great heroes, including, of course, the last surviving Anzac, hugely to Howard's embarrassment, Alex Campbell in Tasmania. And his daughters, when they gave him a state funeral, said, yeah, that's good. We'll have women as pallbearers. He said, Dad was more than a rebel. There'd been a left-wing trade union official in Tasmania who was secretary of the ARU down there, and in the 30s, of course, you're always in danger of being hit on the back of the head by somebody. So he needed a bodyguard. Alex Campbell was his bodyguard, the last of the Anzacs. So there's a whole range of Anzac stories that we can tell as well. We can ask why were there Australian troops at Gallipoli in the first place? We can follow through all of those stories in those ways. But most importantly, I think, to go back to where I started, we have to see war and fighting and conscription for war as part of work for the capitalist system. It's another kind of work on behalf of capital. So when we see a war memorial, we're seeing also a memorial to dead workers. We've got to claim those back from them as well. That came home to me during the anti-Vietnam campaign. I was invited to speak in Newcastle in 1971. We started up by the ocean, several thousand workers, very different marching with several thousand Hunter Valley workers than it is a few thousand students coming out of Sydney University. Very different attitude from the police, I can tell you. We stopped outside the post office. There's a little tiny little war memorial there. And this elderly man got up and said he's just going to say a few words there. He said, when I was 17, I was stupid enough to put my age up to get a bit of adventure and go off and fight for king and country. I'm proud to say that in 1941 my son joined up to stop fascism. And we're both here today to make sure that they don't conscript my grandson to the service of US imperialism. And that's the story of war and how it fits into the class that we need to be putting around in this monumental avalanche of stuff that we're going to get thrown at us in the next 6 or 7 years as the war goes on. Because they will tell us that it is as a result of these things that we have our liberties. I came upon a builders' labourer organiser in Hobart in 1916 who was a great poet. He used to speak in the Domain down in Hobart. And they quote him as saying, "Our liberties were not won by mining magnates and stock exchange jobbers, but by ordinary men and women of the working class who suffered in prison and died on gallows. It is to them that we owe the liberties that we have today." What the Conservatives want us to believe is that our liberties arrived from England in a box marked English upper class export. The reality, of course, is that we got those liberties here before they got them in England. The suffragette movement had a slogan they carried through the streets of London. The Australian women there who were in that movement, they carried it and it said, "Mother, follow your daughters. Give the vote to women in England," as we have in Australia. We've seen, of course, the story of Cuffy as the Chartist, who's transported out here. Another of these examples of how liberties were won in England by radical and militant and indeed revolutionary working class representatives. But the Institute of Public Affairs, one of the conservative think tanks in Australia, the current issue, you can wander into the newsagent, I wouldn't buy it, you can go in and have a look. And it's saying what's wrong with the national curriculum. Amazingly, it picks the example of the English Civil War as something that should be on the national curriculum. Well, 3 cheers to that. What they've left out, however, is King Charles's head. The fact that this was a Republican movement doesn't seem to have occurred to them. They're saying there's a kind of bias in the national curriculum because it doesn't deal with the Civil War and Cromwell. That gave us our liberties, it says. Well, it certainly was one of the points in which they were fought for. So, yes, there's a lot to be grateful to for the English working class, the English peasantry when they rose up. But it's not the kinds of things that the Institute of Public Affairs want us to believe. There is, however, a big anniversary coming up in a month's time, on the 22nd of September, the 60th anniversary of the defeat of the Anti-Red Bill.